decided for my research this summer, the primary goal basically was to first provide a comprehensive definition of magical realism, to show its use in literature, and then to demonstrate its usage in film, in short. Should I be using this microphone?
That'd be great if you don't mind pulling it down. Or you have to take, yeah, just aim it down. Ah,
Hold
great,
down.
thank you.
Okay.
You'll be glad you did that.
Is it on?
Is it on?
Press the button so it's green. I know it's on the top.
Is it good? Gosh, I'm so sorry, I'm not tech savvy. I don't know.
It's not that big a deal, Mr. Mitchell.
Might have just died. Oh, wait, no.
So that's
yeah.
on what it's on.
Whatever happened.
It's on.
Yep,
Okay.
thank
You hear
you.
me?
Yeah, that's
Yes.
better.
Sorry about the technical difficulties. Yeah, so for that general overview was just kind of defining magical realism, showing its use in literature, both in Latin American literature with kind of the forefathers of that movement, and then showing its usage in film once it kind of diffused over. So first, going over magical realism, it's kind of like, where did it come from? What does it mean? And then how it appears in the work of Gabriel Garcia Marquez, primarily using his seminal work, 100 Years of Solitude, because he's kind of known as the forefather of this movement. And finally, the literature-focused part of this discussion will move on to magical realism in the greater Latin American literary sphere, using what I've learned from short stories, from various authors, but primarily I'll be using one from Jorge Luis Borges, but I've also read different ones from him and Julio Cortázar, which are two great Latin American pioneers of magical realism in their own right. And so then we just start to discuss film, how it first came to the silver screen through adaptation of these magical realist novels. So Allende's The House of Spirits, for example, and then its diffusion to Latin American directors, for example, Guillermo del Toro, and then films from outside of Latin America that might be regarded as less typical, but still valuable, in my opinion, as examples of magical realism. Throughout my research, it became increasingly clear to me that this is where it gets even more interesting. It's like the application of a new lens to more recent movies. Oh. And I've titled it Macondo to the Matrix, the transcendence of Marquez's magical realism through storytelling mediums. While I won't be discussing it today, if you've seen The Matrix, you know why I chose my title. The events that happen are surreal, often confusing and jarring to the real world, and for good reason, because, spoiler, most of the movie doesn't take place in the real world. So, for example, in the latest one, we get even more close to examples of magical realism. A lot of not knowing whether this is real or if this is fake, blurring the line between fantasy and reality. And so, for mostly that reason, I'm going to be using film examples that stray from sci-fi or directly fantasy, and instead focusing on kind of more unexpected examples of magical realism. However, as I said, it's one of the movies with fantastic or surreal elements, visual or otherwise, that qualifies it to have magical realism if you look at its elements. So you're looking at it from a different lens, as I said before. I was fascinated to learn in my research, as you will too, that magical realism extended much more recently than I ever thought. So first order of business, what exactly is magical realism? Let's start with the origins of this term. This first started with the German author and art critic Franz Roh, who is largely credited with coining this term of magical realism with his 1925 book, which kind of addresses the newer movements of European painting at that time. In its first introduction to artistic discourse, the term is used to describe the visual arts and the change that occurred in the movements post-World War I. it took this different definition because during those events in our history, they were moving from surrealist forms towards embracing those realism, and because that was unusual for the time, he felt it was important to describe it as magical realism, finding the magic in everyday objects, which is different from the understanding of the term today. So it took until Alejo Carpentier's 1949 essay, which discussed lo real maravilloso for the first time, which basically, in his interpretation, meant as a term that Latin American history for outsiders was so kind of outlandish to outsiders that it would seem fantastical or not real. And so that term was kind of co-opted by Angel Flores in 1955 for those terms to be applied to Latin American literature for the first time. This to me is important that even in its origins as a term, magical realism has moved past the bounds of the before. It's like a small-scale example of magical realism's transcendence of medium. As a term, it transformed into a descriptor of niche visual media to one of a Latin American literary movement. So here's a breakdown. In order to create a more understandable discussion, I've outlined 3 core aspects of magical realism that I will focus on and refer back to for the duration of this presentation. The first one is suspension of disbelief through media and storytelling. We'll get more into that one later, but basically when a reader or a consumer of media suspends their disbelief, they're able to kind of take themselves out of the reality of the rules of the world that we live in and kind of accept the rules as they are in that piece of media. The second one would be coexistence of realism and fantasy. So ordinary and magical elements would coexist within the same narrative, often without clear boundaries within them. Basically, surreal events in our normal world just with basically different rules. Third would be plausible acceptance. Characters in magical realist stories typically accept magical occurrences as a normal part of their reality, even though these events might seem fantastical to the reader or to the watcher. Sorry about that. So, starting on 100 Years of Solitude, that seminal work that we discussed before. From the very outset, Marquez introduces the reader to the Buendia family lineage. They're very peculiar as they start this town based on, essentially, a possession of a ghost. He decides to leave, start his own town in the middle of Colombia named Macondo. This family is characterized by an insomnia plague, traits like prophetic dreams. These traits might seem fantastical, but they're embraced by the characters as innate examples or aspects of their own existence. For example, there's a character in the story, Remedios the Beauty, who's regarded as the most beautiful woman to have ever existed. And then even her scent causes men to go absolutely crazy for her. And so eventually she practically ascends into the heavens and nobody looks the other way. And so you can see, as this suggests, as this slide suggests, that it tells the story of many, many generations of this singular family coinciding with their demise, which we'll get to. But the fictional setting of Macondo serves as a microcosm of this greater Latin American experience. Again, going back to lo real maravilloso, this referring to Latin American history. And the setting is like a canvas for Marquez to explore those historical, political, and societal themes. It shows the banana company's influence on this town, which mirrors in Colombia's history, along with the massacre that happened in the 1920s, that mirror itself in that story. The different wars that happened, especially the civil ones, and the changing landscape, those are all intertwined with magical events, prophecies, etc. There's a rain of yellow flowers, and there's an insomnia plague. All of that, ghosts of dead soldiers, are magical and real coexisting to convey the meanings that Garcia Marquez is trying to suggest. And so, in 100 Years of Solitude, we're going back to those 3 different aspects of magical realism. First, that suspension of disbelief I talked about. So the reader is immediately confronted with what I call a frame story. This device I kind of borrowed from 1001 Nights, where in his autobiography he discusses how Scheherazade, by virtue of her telling you this story, you take it as truth. That is the role that Marquez intends to fill here. and the role that he intends to fill here while he's describing the storytellers and their memories. The first lines of this story is, many years later, as he faced the firing squad, Colonel Aureliano Buendia was to remember that distant afternoon when his father took him to discover ice. So that's kind of some sort of frame story. You know what's going to happen, and yet it'll happen a lot later. It keeps happening. The different firing squads that happen, they end up escaping the death or they don't. Different memories serve to frame the story of these characters until eventually it all coincides with this one narrative that this magical gypsy who comes to this town named Melquiades creates for their town, basically chronicling this entire family's history and showing them that they were destined essentially for ruin. In this prophecy, he says, sorry about that. In this prophecy, saying that the first of this line is tied to a tree, which would be the first of the line, Jose Arcadio Buendia, and the last is being eaten by ants, which is a prophecy that he gives, and it ends up becoming true as Aureliano, the last of the family, reads it. And so, we can see that his influence extends onto the greater Latin American literary sphere. And for this example, I chose to use Jose Luis Borges, his short story, Borges y Yo. The narrator, Borges, is separated from, quote-unquote, the other one, the one called Borges, and resigns himself to the fate of losing himself completely. Essentially, his private self cannot recognize his public persona, and he views them as different people as his mind changed. In this magical realism, you see that acceptance of the surreal, that plausible acceptance, framed in the questioning of his mind, which is that frame story we talked about. Obviously, I'm kind of using this as a case-by-case, case study basis because I couldn't cover all of the examples that I discussed in my paper. So moving on to cinematic magical realism. First, we're going to start with film adaptation. So these are going to refer to adaptations of previous magical realist novels written by Latin American authors who intended it for adaptation for the silver screen. That first one being Isabel Allende and the House of Spirits, who ended up getting it turned into a movie in 1993, directed by Bill August, and then Laura Escobar, like Water for Chocolate, which got turned into a movie by Alfonso Arau in 1993. So you can kind of see how those ideas, now having been turned into novels that have become movies, have now diffused their way into film, into Spanish language film that was eventually dubbed over. And yet, this ends up influencing the greater Latin American film sphere. So, in 2006, we can see that with Guillermo del Toro's Pan's Labyrinth, which is basically a movie that follows kind of a similar journey as one of the characters in 100 Years of Solitude. She goes down, it also carries these political messagings because it's during Franco's reign in Spain. If you know anything about that, it was very brutal after the Spanish Civil War, and so it parallels that narrative of the same girl going down into this underworld, trying to basically fulfill this quest to make it out alive. And it carries those same political messagings, that same surrealist, absurd ideas that that magical realism intends to convey, and that's the lens that I look at this film through. As well, another Latin American filmmaker, who both are Mexican, Alejandro Inarritu's Birdman. Essentially, this writer ends up, his perception of himself is distorted. You see the same elements as in 100 Years of Solitude. I haven't discussed this yet, but a priest ends up levitating to prove himself of his religion in 100 Years of Solitude. This man in Birdman does the same exact thing. So I found very many connections through these two movies, and I found it very interesting that these two Latin American filmmakers started doing it essentially before many others. And so we go beyond. Oh, it's a little blurry. Okay, there we go. Okay, so in 2010, Edgar Wright directed and ended up debuting with Scott Pilgrim vs. the World, which was actually based on a graphic novel series, which is evident in the film's heavy stylization that lends itself to employing these magical film qualities. It ends up employing video game logic, remember those different logical rules in our world that allow for these surreal happenings. And then those real world consequences are blended with video game logic. For example, Scott in this movie has to defeat his love interest's evil exes in order to be able to win her love. And as he defeats them, they burst into coins as video game logic. And so that kind of absurd, surreal, not quite real is the object of some of these films. And so that's the lens that you're able to look at it through. And for Ruby Sparks, this carries heavy similarities to Melquiades in the book. There's an author, Colgan, who ends up writing into existence this girl named Ruby, who he imagines to be this perfect girl for him. And he ends up being able to write into existence anything that she does. And eventually, after they fight, he gives her free will and she is freed. And yet, it's kind of like a parallel with Melquiades because it's examining free will, how all of these things have maybe been predetermined who was her creator. Okay. And so what does this mean, right? Personally, I took in this research that different lenses of film and the different ways that you look at things can influence the way that we take away a message from film. For example, if you look at this like an uneducated reader, 100 Years of Solitude, it just seems like a story that's fantastical. It's a silly romp through this town that's existed for so long and eventually goes into ruin. If you know the history behind it, you know that there's foreign investors involved in this banana company, involved in military coups that happen all over Latin America that Marquez wanted to speak out about, and yet you can see that in some of these other films. For example, Pan's Labyrinth being taking place after the Spanish Civil War, speaking out against that fascism. Or in The Matrix, maybe, as he struggles with what is real and what is not real. And so, in finality, I think that this magical realism, most categorize it as a genre, yet it is not a genre. It is more like a lens that you're able to look at through the world and then take at what you will, the truth. As Marquez said in his autobiography, by virtue of him telling it, it makes him the truth. So then what is it that we take away from our own narratives and what we consume? Is it the truth? That's the question he raises. Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to open it up to questions, please.
Taylor, can you give us a little insight into the evolution of this project? Kind of where you got the inspiration to start with Marquez and then how it ended up where
So,
it is today?
I ended up becoming fascinated with Gabriel Garcia Marquez. I can't remember if it was in our book club where we read Chronicle of a Death Foretold first, or it was my abuela coming back from Colombia, and she always gets me books when she comes back, and she got a copy of Cien Años de Soledad, which is the Spanish version of this book. And I ended up reading it and kind of falling in love with the style of writing, and I became fascinated with how this man is a storyteller. And I mean, that's the goal of all of these entertaining mediums, trying to tell a story, even if it is the truth or what if it isn't. I found that very fascinating, and the way that it was tied into Colombian history, I kind of wanted to learn about my own culture, and then I felt like it needed, so much has been said about 100 Years of Solitude, I felt like it needed some sort of connection to the modern day, that like this, not this genre, but magical realism could be applied to modern day life and the narratives that we receive. I mean, even, I can think of in 2020, there was a film release called Tenet that it has kind of these time jumps and that blur of reality and what is real and what is the past, where all of these narratives of time are taking place essentially at the same time, that mirrors Marquez's La Joya Rasca or Leaf Storm, which takes place in Macondo, the same town as 100 Years of Solitude. So I became kind of fascinated with how you can kind of connect everything.
you talked about Birdman by Inarritu and Pan Slap and by Del Toro. I think there are two more movies by those two guys which are very similar. Shape of Water by Del Toro, which you remember, and this Bardo, that was a project by Inarritu, but it wasn't very successful. Have you seen those movies?
Sorry, what was that last one?
Bardo,
I haven't seen that last one, but I have seen.
it was not widely released. It was, I think, released during COVID, and it was distribution only. So maybe you missed that one.
Yeah.
But with similar ideas, just you are, like unthinkable things like this is a fish.
It's like a fish guy,
like,
yeah, and it's just
shape of
happening
water.
in this real world.
So
It's just a
you just believe.
I thought I was just fascinated in the original novel by how, this woman who is so beautiful flies off and her family is totally normal about it, and Fernanda, who is married, she's like a sister-in-law to her, is jealous because she got her garments that they were hanging out dirty. That was it. So it was fascinating how nonchalant everything could be. And he said in his autobiography that it reminds him of the stories his grandma would tell, that no matter how absurd they sounded or how far-fetched, like it would be said with the same delivery and same conviction of truth, which is interesting.
So I know you said that, I think the term was first coined in 1925 by Roe, right?
Mm-hmm.
Where was, I don't know if that's a he or she, where was that person from?
So this was in Germany,
Okay.
and so it was used. I'm gonna have to look up the actual art movement, but there was an art movement going on in response to how surreal art was getting at the time.
Mhm.
There was a German art movement focused on going back to realism, the real life, real objects, and so he coined that term. Essentially, his magic realism was referring to how he found the magic in those everyday objects again after spending so much time in the surreal art world.
Did you find any information? Because I feel like it probably predates that. Like I would imagine that there are tribal stories, from native communities that tie very much into this, magical realism, especially those that had, use things like peyote and certain, ceremonies that they had. I can't imagine that they would not have stories like this that they would share. Did you find anything like that and see if there were like origins in different communities or different, tribes in different areas?
I think it's less of I try to shy away from sci-fi or maybe psychological thriller or those kind of psychological genres, because the whole thing is like, oh, it was all in your head. But the whole thing about magical realism, to me, especially in Latin American literary context, is that it is in the real world, and that, like, to put it like bluntly, like everyone's sober and this is happening just as it is. It's just this fantastical, unreal thing happening. So, I mean, I guess I could apply it to kind of myth and legend. It kind of has a similar vibe, but I don't know. I think that term having relation to like how outsiders believe Latin American history just couldn't be real. Like whether it's the cruelty or just how unrealistic it seemed to a European audience at that time. I think that it plays into a lot of how Marquez did his work, because it was like, oh, if this is so unreal, if I'm going to stage Colombian history as this town of Macondo, then I'm going to have it be unreal. If you guys want it unreal, I will make it unreal.
And didn't he draw inspiration from stories his grandmother would tell him?
Mm-hmm.
So that's my point.
His grandfather was a
I think that it predates the
absolutely.
official time
That's just like
that
giving it
got
a term.
coined. That's what I'm saying is this something that, came up in one specific culture? Do you think it has come up in a lot of different cultures around the world? And that's why, maybe that's part of the reason why too, that it transcends so many different types of media, because it was something that as humans grew and developed and grew culture and societies, they, kind of exchanged these different ideas and stories and things like that.
I think with any culture that has a strong, kind of deep-rooted sense of oral storytelling, I think that's definitely a big thing in Latin American culture, and I know it is in a lot of other cultures, especially like in like the indigenous Americas. I know oral storytelling is a huge thing, and it definitely played a big part into this whole magical realism, as even though it's called like referred to it by critics as this genre now, those kinds of stories definitely existed beforehand.
Certainly, Allende, I'm glad that you brought her up in the House of the Spirits and Eva Luna. All that work from her early work all seemed to be heavily embedded with this. I think she's moved away from it. She's become stateside. I think she's going down a different road. Did you mention Mario Vargas Llosa?
Yes.
Did you mention Llosa?
I think, yes.
Which works were you referencing? Very specifically, what were you referencing with his work?
I think I used, because I knew that the presentation would probably run long if I didn't do so, I used one case study from Borges as a short story, but I read several. I read, oh gosh, what's his name? Sorry, I'm blanking on them right now as I'm up here, but yeah, I used several short stories, and I used the novels more to inform how those films were adapted onto screen.
I know that your mentor has advised you that you could actually do considerable work with this going further in academic life if you wanted to pursue this even at a doctoral level. This is a, you know, this is a great introduction, but this is a topic that you could really go far with. Are you interested in doing that?
Sure. I mean, if I have not the excuse, like the opportunity to pursue like something that I'm passionate about and something that I'm really interested in, then I'd love to do that. And I'm really interested in this, so it's a great way to kind of connect, I guess, searching for those elements of my own culture and history, being born in the United States, with, you know, the films that I grew up with, the stuff that I saw in theaters. So.
When you say your culture, I mean, do you have Colombian ancestry?
Yeah, my mom.
Okay. That's something new. I just learned something today. All right, thank you very much.
I have one quick